Okay, we're at 2 o'clock. I believe that's the time that the live broadcast starts. So welcome to Caltech's first ML and Astro Day. Um, see if I can do this. So as you'll all appreciate, this is the year that machine learning has become respectable. Physics Nobel Prize 2 weeks ago was awarded to John Hopfield, Geoffrey Hinton, for work that they did to use physics to find patterns in information. And then the chemistry one, the day later, was for the application of AI for revealing protein secrets through computing and artificial intelligence. So this now entirely justifies the use of machine learning and astronomy for science. But what's interesting actually is I came across a paper from 30 years ago by George, with his student Nick Weir and Umar Fayed at JPL, and this says that they're describing a system that's going to be used as a testbed for practical astronomical applications of AI technology, including machine learning, expert systems, etc. A vast variety of scientific projects will be possible with this, including studies of large-scale structure, galactic structure, automatic identification of sources from other wavelengths, radio through X-ray, generation of objective catalogs of clusters and groups of galaxies, searches for quasars, variable or extreme objects. I mean, that's a really good summary of the sorts of things what we want to do in the application of machine learning to astronomy. And I understand from George that Nick Weir had actually discussed with John Hopfield a lot of the application of neural networks to do this. So this was, 30 years ago. So the aim of today is to try and start the next generation of discussions between current Caltech astronomers of all flavors. And we don't have enough time slots in the schedule this afternoon to have someone from every group. So if you feel underrepresented or missed out, it was not intentional. We just tried to be as broad as possible. No one from, for example, no one from Phil Hopkins' group was available, but we have some slides from Aisha, one of Phil's postdocs, and we'll be sharing that when we put the material up online afterwards so that our ML friends can see the sorts of problems they're thinking about. The first step in this sort of transdisciplinary, to use the horrible word that NSF now favors for this type of thing, transdisciplinary collaboration, or the phrase they really like is transdisciplinary convergence. So you come up with methods which are applicable, whatever you want to call it, is to understand each other's works. And so the focus really on this afternoon is communication for the Astro folks to say, these are the things I'm working on. These are the types of problems where I think I need some assistance or maybe where I can help. And also for our CS friends in the room to say, this is what I'm working on, and to see if that might grab someone's interest. Oh, that sounds like something that could be relevant for the Astro problem I'm working on, and that sort of thing. So we also speak different languages. So again, part of this initial thing is to try and understand when I'm talking about this is what I mean, or when, what I call something may be called something else technically in CS, but when I describe the problem, then you realize, oh, that's what you're trying to do. Oh, right, what you want to be doing is not that, but that, because that, things like that. Presenting the challenges and also trying to understand the data. There are the old stories that CS people will tell you that they can solve any problem, and then they see real data and they go, oh no, but that's not real data. We've been working with this perfectly simulated stuff or whatever. Similarly, when we take our data to CS folks or statisticians, they always throw up their hands and go, well, that's horrible. How can you possibly get anything meaningful out of that? So again, appreciation of the sorts of things that we think we work on or familiar with working on, or understanding actually what it is with working on. So with that in mind, this is for this afternoon. We are sort of switching. We've got 5 Astro speakers and 5 CS speakers broadly. I think Katie just told me that Zach Ross is feeling ill this afternoon, so we may have a spare slot there where we may have some discussion. We'll see. They're 15 minutes each, but what we're intending is that they're 7-minute lightning presentations by each speaker, and then there's sort of 5 minutes, 6 minutes for question or slight discussion. It's those, so please ask questions or please raise points where things aren't clear or whatever for clarification. It's that communication which is the most important thing, and then we'll do 3 minutes for changeover where people can continue talking, but we're just switching out laptops for the thing. As with the regular Wednesday Astro Colloquia in here, we are on the Astro YouTube channel, and so this is being recorded. We had a number of folks, particularly from JPL, where there's interest in this activity as well, who were saying, will it be recorded? And I was on travel last week, so we arranged this all last minute this morning, so I apologize for that. One of the things we're obviously interested in as well is not only communication, but collaboration, in the sense that, you know, are there funds that we can chase that we can both benefit from, and relevant faculty in the room of all descriptions is the Carver Mead Ventures Fund. Proposals are due in 10 days' time, but this is 10 to 50K for this academic year, and next academic year can be spent on. They're expecting to do 5 or 7 seed grants, but this is discretionary and could be used to support students or postdocs or mental workshops or visitors or anything that it could be used as seed funding to get a collaborative activity started. So if there is something we, you know, let's say Andrew tells us about some exoplanets thing this afternoon, and that grabs someone's attention from the CS in the in the audience, and maybe there's oh, well, we only need to write 1 page. It's only a 1-page white submission, so it's not that much to write. Maybe that's something we could quickly put together and put in, and then we can see. And they are saying that they also encourage the submission of projects related to the AI for Science initiative on campus. So this sort of fits very nicely into that purview. Obviously, there've been a couple of other initiatives recently announced as well. We missed the AMD AI computing one, but I'm sure that will happen again, just for cycles for computing. But maybe that's something tangible that can come out of this first one. We're also anticipating that this is the first activity. We don't know what form the next thing might do. So what we will do is we will send out a survey after, just to see what people's, do we want to do monthly seminars, or do we want a monthly lunch meet between interested folks, or blah, 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 that sort of thing, just to solicit opinion on that, as I say. And with that, I think I'm at my time. So I think our first speaker is Susan. So if Susan wants to come up, and we'll see if this actually works. Still showing that interesting. I'll give you 2 minutes warning. 5 minutes.
Cool. Well, I will do my best to get this out in 7 minutes. So I'm Susan Redmond. I'm a postdoc with Dimitri Maue. I'm mainly on the instrumental side, and a little bit. Oh. Good question. Has a green light. Good. Okay. Sorry. So I should do this. Turn this one on.
Testing.
One, two, three. Says it's on.
Testing.
Okay, I'll try and talk really loud. Is this any better? Like, at the mic? A little bit better with, okay, I'll keep the mic up. Okay. So, yeah. So I mainly work on instrumentation projects. The big one for a lot of astronomers that's coming up is the Habitable Worlds Observatory. So this was recommended by the Astro 2020 Decadal Survey. It would hypothetically launch in the 2040s if it's on schedule. And it's a major focus for NASA over the next decade. So there's going to be a lot of funding opportunities through this mission. And there's a link to the homepage down there. So the two main goals for Habitable Worlds is to take a pale blue dot photo of an exoplanet. So to actually get photons from an exoplanet. And then also we want to take spectra of that to figure out what's in the atmosphere and whether or not it could be habitable. And so before we get into kind of the science of it, I wanted to go over kind of telescopes 101, which one of the main things that we look at is what's called the point spread function. So if you have a star and that passes through an opening, such as a single slit, then you get your fringe pattern, if you remember from the single slit experiment. If you have a nice, perfect circular aperture, then you get what we call the circular aperture point spread function. So it's this, we call it an airy disk. And so a lot of observational astronomy, at least in the visible and UV, we want a very small PSF so you can distinguish between different objects. So if you have two objects really close to each other, you don't want to misinterpret that as like an oblong object. We want a very stable point spread function. So that way, when you're taking a bunch of images over time, you're not getting different shapes because the shape of your mirror is changing or things like that. And we also want it to be able to very accurately model the PSF. And that's for the post-processing to get whatever signal that we're interested in out of the data. So if we go then into the instrument, so first we want to be able to build a good telescope that generates a good PSF to begin with. Then when we're pointing on sky, we want to be able to keep that stable PSF so we get whatever data we want. And that can look very different. So on the left here, we have wide field imaging from a balloon telescope called SuperBit. And on the right, we have what we call a dark hole from exoplanet imaging. And then we want to be able to post-process that data and get whatever signal out that we want. So this is an example of exoplanet data. So on the left, you can't really see the planet. And then we put it through this big pipeline. And then on the right, we can extract the planet out of that. I'm going to focus today on this direct imaging of exoplanets. And hopefully this will play. So this is the Roman Space Telescope that's going to launch in the next couple of years. It's kind of a pathfinder. Well, Roman has a wide field instrument on it that is doing really great science, but the coronagraph on it is a pathfinder for the Habitable Worlds Observatory. So normally we can't see the planet because it's hidden behind all the starlight. So we put this mask in place that blocks the majority of the starlight, and then we can see the planet. So this is just a little demo of how those two, there's generally two sets of masks. We refer to those as the coronagraph. And then they block the starlight. But then we get these little misalignments in the system, or there's manufacturing defects in the components. And so then you actually get these residual starlight speckles that build up, which you can see in the little panel on the right. And so then we can't actually see the planet again. And so then what we do is we've developed these things called deformable mirrors. So that's shown up here. And these mirrors have all these little pistons behind it that can change shape. And using those mirrors, we can figure out what the shape is of the incoming aberrated wavefront and then shape the mirror to correct for it and then suppress that residual starlight so we can actually see the planet. And so now you can see the planet is kind of coming through over here over time. And so, yeah. So for exoplanet imaging, one of the first main goals is to be able to sufficiently suppress the starlight to be dimmer than the planet to begin with. So as we kind of saw in that animation, the light comes in through our telescope, hits our deformed mirrors, goes through our chronograph, and then it arrives at our science camera. So we're imaging the intensity, but we're adjusting the electric field with the deformable mirrors. Oopsies, sorry. And so we take these images and we pass it through some sort of wavefront sensing and control algorithm. And this is a big place where like AI and machine learning might come into play. Generally, these involve some sort of influence matrix or Jacobian of how the deformed mirrors affect the science camera, and things like system identification and things like that can be really helpful. And this is just a demo of how that works. So we start with a really bright speckle field, and then over time we can kind of suppress that. A note is that in the lab, in air at least, we can generally get about 8 orders of magnitude of starlight suppression. In a vacuum, we can get down to a few times 10 to the minus 10, but HWO will need like 1 times 10 to the minus 10. So there's a lot of R&D involved both in developing coronagraphs that can achieve that level of suppression and also a wavefront sensing control loop that can do that as well. So then we need to maintain it. So if we just keep the mirrors as is and there are thermal drifts in the system and things like that, we actually get all these speckles that build up, so we can't actually see the planet. So we've developed some additional wavefront sensing and control loops that can suppress that. And just to note that for HWO, you can't just expose for a really long time. You have to take shorter exposures because of cosmic rays and all these other things. So we can't just, collect all the photons from the planet that we want in one shot. We have to take separate images, and we get noise in each image and all that thing. So that introduces additional difficulties. And then we want to be able to extract the planet signal from the data. And so we want to take all that noisy data and then actually be able to see the planet, and then obviously take a spectrum as well. So I'm involved with the working group for the Habitable Worlds Observatory. If anyone's interested in participating, let me know. We have a machine learning branch of it as well. And so this is kind of an example of what the data can look like. And in both of these is from ground-based instruments. And one of these circled dots is not a planet. And so it's a bit of a game of Where's Waldo to figure out which one's real and which one's not. And so it's really going to be really important for the Habitable Worlds Observatory to be able to distinguish between these starlight speckles and planets. And when we get to these higher orders of magnitude of starlight suppression, this gets more and more difficult. And so just kind of a brief summary of different ways that AI and astronomy can work together in this particular arena. The first is optomechanical design. So designing either the coronagraph to suppress the starlight, or even like the shapes of the mirrors and how they are mechanically constructed. The next is sense and control, and that kind of has 2 flavors as well. So that can either be initial alignment of the telescope or real time. This is the famous Hubble image in the top there. And then the last is the data analysis. So PSF, modeling that PSF and being able to figure out what's starlight and what's planet light. And we had a bit of a brainstorming session in our group meeting last week, and this was kind of some things that we came up with. In the middle here, these are 2 things that I didn't talk about. But if you have questions about radio velocity opportunities or spectroscopy, let me know. And yeah, if you have any questions. Right. I mean, we don't, the main thing that we use that's currently been, the main avenue that machine learning has currently been used in is like some sort of system identification to system ID, like system identification, to figure out how the deformed mirrors affect the images, and because you can have a model for that, but it's not always accurate. I mean, that's the way we currently do it, but I mean, these are just like avenues that could potentially benefit. It's not using machine learning with this type of thing is I mean, it's a relatively young field on its own. I think the data analysis is the biggest thing it's started to be used for.
So that your just most broad question.
Uh, I'm not sure. I mean, there's like a number of things that go into the existence of the speckles. And I think the biggest thing, one of the biggest things that we struggle with right now is, you know, you can design something that suppresses both starlight at one wavelength, but as soon as you deviate from that, it tanks. So, uh, and it's been really hard with traditional optimization techniques to figure out something that can actually suppress the starlight over a wider range of wavelengths. But as for the, yeah,
Thing that springs to my mind. Super resolution.
yeah. And I think another big thing is this bottom point here is for habitable worlds, when you compare two stars, because it's going to be such a big telescope and it's going to resolve the star, every star is going to look a little bit different. When you're not really resolving the star, every star kind of looks the same. So you can get away with generating a whole mirror shape or a mask shape or whatever, and it'll work for all the stars at a certain suppression level. But when you get down to that 10 to the minus 10 level and you're resolving the star, then everything looks a little bit different. So if there's some way to learn what different stars would look like and adjust everything to fit each star, I think that would also be a interesting avenue. Yeah. Yeah, so there's kind of a big question right now of, so, you know, you need to hit 10 to the minus 10 starlit suppression, but what variants are you allowed to have around that and still be able to get the planet signal out? And I think with traditional techniques, we can get that variance down to like an order of magnitude below whatever you hit. So if you hit 10 to the minus 10, you can get 10 to the minus 11 variance on that. But some people think that we need like 10 to the minus 12 or 10 to the minus 13 variance on that. And I don't see us being able to do that with traditional, like just, you know, we make a model of the system and run a control loop on it. Because it's just it's so sensitive to every little thing. So yeah.
Uh, Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for being here. So my name is Ricardo Baptista. I was an instructor in the CMS, Computing and Mathematical Sciences department over the last 2 years. I am actually moving next year to Toronto to the Statistics and Department and the Vector Institute, which, as we heard this just earlier, now also does physics. And today I just wanted to talk a little bit about some work on sampling high-dimensional probability distributions using score-based diffusion models. I'll talk a little bit about how we do that before I get started. So this is joint work with some great collaborators, both here at Caltech, at Google, and at the University of Montreal, amongst other places. So before getting into diffusion models, broadly, my work focuses on coming up with methodology for generative modeling. So the way I see this problem mathematically is that we are, in many settings, given samples of some probability distribution. We don't have access to the underlying density. We just have samples from this distribution. These could be samples of images of faces or images of exoplanets like we just saw. But they could also be, for instance, collections of corpuses of text, molecules, other structured objects. And our goal is to come up with a model, a generative process that can generate new samples from this distribution that have samples that have the same statistical properties as the ones that we've already seen. And importantly, are not those same ones that already existed in the training data set. They should be new images of, for instance, new molecules that can hopefully accelerate the scientific process of exploring the space of possible molecules. Now, one kind of popular method to define this generative process over the last few years has been to use a stochastic process, often known as a diffusion model, which takes starts with, we can think of just an image of Gaussian noise here on the right-hand side, and transforms it into an image from this distribution that we'd like to sample from on the left, using a stochastic differential equation. And the way that it does this, without getting into a lot of the details, is that it first describes how you would actually take data on the left to Gaussian noise on the right, how you would corrupt samples, and then tries to reverse this process, this corruption process, by modifying and controlling the way that we add noise to our data in order to go back to samples of this data distribution. Now, in order to actually solve this problem, this kind of amounts to, or in order to do this, run this process, this amounts to then learning some objects, in this case, what are known as score functions that define the drifts of these processes. And over the last few years, this has really kind of taken off. So we've seen a lot of applications of using this generative model to sample and generate very high dimensional images and other objects. So for instance, we've seen this being used in prompt to image models where you input some text and you can generate images that we can argue never existed before, as well as applications in the scientific domain, in particular applications, for instance, of solving inverse problems where we want to take some noisy observations and then generate an image of the underlying unknown quantity that we can't directly measure. But what I want to focus on today is how we would use these methods when the data that we're interested in sampling is not just a finite dimensional image, but actually is something infinite dimensional, something like a function. So one can argue why this is needed for things like imaging. And the reason is that what we're seeing is that these models are being applied to get finer and finer resolution images. And so we're really approaching this continuum limit, and the continuum limit of these objects would be actual infinite dimensional functions. And we need methods that actually can generate functions at a cost that doesn't scale with the dimensionality of the images if we were to discretize them. And then afterwards, I want to show how to also apply this in the context of solving inverse problems where the underlying objects are also naturally functions. So just to briefly highlight how we address these two problems. So first, in the context of, for the problem of infinite dimensional data or trying to sample functions, the two things that we do are to modify this diffusion process by not just adding finite dimensional noise, but adding noise that comes from, that is itself a function. So in this case, we use Gaussian processes. And I just want to visually show what the effect of that is. So if we take data that is generated at a particular resolution, and we do use standard diffusion models to sample from this distribution at higher resolutions, so going from left to right, this is increasing the resolution at which we want to sample. Current state-of-the-art models will tend to degenerate. So you can see that if you try to generate higher resolutions, they really miss the fact that this is bimodal distribution of a Gaussian mixture. On the top, we have what would happen if we instead use this function valued noise that can generate these data from this distribution at any resolution and kind of preserves the structure. And you can look at this also in terms of the error as a function of the resolution, really see that when you do add a structured function valued noise, this allows you to generate samples at a cost that's independent of the data resolution. And in the context of imaging, this ultimately what we observe is that it leads to not having a lot of issues like mode collapse that you typically see when you try to go to higher resolutions with these standard diffusion models. Very briefly, I just want to touch on a problem that I think would be of interest to this community, which is how to use a lot of these problems to solve inverse problems. And the motivating application I want to consider is one that came to us from the climate community. It's a problem known as statistical downscaling, where what we get to observe are coarse, low fidelity images of, for instance, the weather on the Earth. And what we want to do is map them to what we would get from a high fidelity, high resolution model. And there have been a lot of techniques to from the diffusion model and machine learning community in order to do this. But typically what they assume is that we can sample both of these models. So a low fidelity coarse model that might be missing physics and this high resolution model, maybe starting from the same initial condition, and we can get these paired samples that we can use to map one from one resolution to the other. The challenge in climate is that often we're dealing with chaotic dynamical systems for the weather, and as a result, we can't actually run both two different models at two different resolutions starting from the same initial conditions and actually get paired samples out. So that actually leads to a problem where we want to, let's say in this case, correct and super resolve coarse simulations, but without paired data from these two different models. So in some recent work, we showed actually how to do this by first taking coarse resolutions on the top right, correcting them by solving, using some techniques from optimal transport to align coarse resolution model outputs to coarsened high fidelity models, and then use standard super resolution techniques to go from the bottom right to these high fidelity, high resolution data on the left. And so we apply this to data, for instance, here this is some data from a two-dimensional Navier-Stokes solver, going from low fidelity, very coarse models, correcting it at the coarse resolution, and then super resolving it. And this is all done without paired data of the left and the right, so just independent samples from these two different resolution models. Just, I know I went a few minutes over, so just to summarize, so my focus is on how to sample high dimensional distributions of, for instance, images, and use these to, for instance, solve inverse problems. We have a lot of kind of ongoing work, some with Katie and Berthie from CMS on, for instance, how to use these methods with while also incorporating some physical constraints that we might have about the process that we're trying to sample, as well as I look a lot at how to regularize some of these approaches when we don't have a lot of data. So thanks for your time. Happy to take any questions. Great. Thanks for the question. So if I could just repeat it, so you're asking here what we considered is adding noise from a Gaussian process, and in traditional models, you would add noise from IID Gaussian noise at every pixel. And can you see, for instance, one as the limit of the other with a small kernel? So yes, I mean, the IID case is you're really taking each pixel to be completely independent. So while in the case of this function-valued Gaussian process noise, there is correlation across the pixels. If you were to take the correlation all the way to 0, then effectively you're making every pixel independent. So here we're considering this smooth noise. In practice, most of the existing methods would use independent noise. I just want to make sure I understand when you say in practice. No, it does have it's smooth. So the actual draws from the process are smooth functions. Yes, thanks. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah. So in this particular case, so let's say we have these two different models, a coarse model and a high fidelity model. You could, for instance, run them from the same initial condition, but because they are chaotic, the paths of these two models of the two climate simulations will diverge over time. And if you actually did a statistical test to compare, let's say after 10 years, the samples that you get from these two different models at many different initial conditions, they are statistically independent from each other, just due to the fact that they're chaotic and kind of decorrelate over time. And as a result, even though technically they did start from the same initial condition, there's no correlation at all in these two sets of samples from these two different models. So you can't, if you try to learn anything by assuming that they're paired, there would be nothing to learn because they would be just independent. We're trying to take an output from this coarsened model and just map it to what the output could look like as if from this like high resolution model, meaning that it has the same statistics of the high resolution model. But it's not necessarily, you can't map it like to a trajectory of the high resolution model. It's just, it's going to have the same statistics. Thanks for clarifying. A great question. Yes. So this is a very like an open problem, I would say, with diffusions. And just generative modeling more broadly, whether or not something is it's tied to whether or not something is actually being memorized from the training data set, and whether it's a brand new, fresh sample that has the same properties. Can't really comment much on the hallucination because I'm not. This is something I'm wondering about, but don't really have anything concrete. In terms of the memorization aspect, so you could. Ideally, you could actually go through the training data set and check how close you are to some of the images in the training data set. And people have done this and observed that in some cases you do get very close. And so that, because it's close to an image in the training data set, it's not really something brand new. And oftentimes, even when it's very close to an image in the training data set, it seems like a fresh sample, but it's actually just something hallucinated. So there are checks for this. And we are working on some work to regularize some of these models to avoid that issue, but it's still open. Yeah. I would say that you do see a lot more of this memorization with diffusions than other methods. Yes. Great question. Actually, I'm agnostic to that. So most of the theory that I work on is actually independent of whether one uses a diffusion or not. And in fact, the last approach, for instance, for inverse problems, it's actually based on two elements. One is just using some techniques from optimal transport, which we just implement using we can think of them as just like normalizing flows, deterministic maps. And even though part of that was done with diffusions, just because they're empirically good with high resolution images, it could have also been done with other generative models. Thanks.
Is right over there. All right, hey everyone. I'm Andrew Howard. I'm a professor of astronomy. I'm going to do something unusual, which is I'm going to talk for 5 or 6 minutes, and then I'm going to invite up Yan Liang, who is visiting here from Princeton, who is precisely at the interface that we're talking about here of astronomy and ML. So I'm going to motivate the problem, describe some general solutions, and then Yan is going to tell us about her particular solution, which I am excited about. I'll mention at the outset, the reason that Yan is visiting, or one of them, is that she's shopping around for postdocs at the moment, and it is my hope that we can find a way to bring her to Caltech. So if folks in the audience know of methods by which we could do that, perhaps collaborative, please come and talk to both of us after this. Okay, so I'm going to give a very high level, start very high level, and then we're going to go deep. The problem that I am the most interested in at the moment, and which I think could benefit the most from ML techniques, is the discovery of Earth-like planets around nearby stars using the radial velocity technique. The basic method that we rely on is the fact that as the star orbits a planet, it causes the planet orbits the star has a little pirouette motion, and we can measure one component of that motion, the so-called radial velocity, by the Doppler shifting of the stellar spectrum. We have a new fancy instrument to do this called the Keck Planet Finder, which was installed at Keck Observatory about 2 years ago. It has all sorts of fancy engineering that I'm not going to go into in a 5-minute talk. But suffice it to say, we have lowered the instrumental noise floor. That is, we've gotten more precise so that we're able to detect smaller signals from small planets, which also makes us sensitive to astrophysical noise that we want to get rid of. So just to motivate our discovery space here, this is a typical plot made by someone in my group 5 years or so ago. The blue region above in a space of planet mass on the vertical axis and planet separation on the horizontal axis. The blue region is where we have very good detectability. The red region is where we are insensitive. And you can see that we're pretty good at detecting Jupiter and Saturn if they're orbiting far out. We can detect small planets down to about 5 or 10 Earth masses if they're orbiting close in. But we really want to push this diagonal line down. And we have ways of doing that, we think, with traditional and kind of near-term techniques. With the first dotted line, we really need to go to the second dotted line where there's that little E labeled there. That's the Earth. That's a 10 centimeter per second signal, which is very difficult to discover. So here's the technical nut of the problem and the real challenge. Showing a slide of real data. This is about 1/100th of the spectrum of a sun-like star. Each of those little dips in intensity as a function of wavelength, it's actually as a function of pixel here, because that's how we think about it as the detector, but its intensity as a function of wavelength. Each one of those little dips corresponds to the wavelength of a particular electronic transition in the atmosphere of the star. And collectively, these act as a sort of fingerprint of the star and its spectrum. A Doppler shift, the thing we're trying to measure, which tells us about the orbit of the planet, corresponds to nearly a translation of this spectrum. The scale of the translation is incredibly small. It's about 10 to the minus 4 pixels is 10 centimeters per second. So it's an incredibly small shift that we're trying to discover. If there were no other astrophysics going on, we could actually solve this problem right away using classical techniques like cross-correlation. The problem is that a single line, which I've blown up there, will respond to perturbations in the surface of the star by changing its shape subtly. So for example, if there's a star spot, where a region of concentrated magnetic field that's a little bit darker, that star spot will migrate across the surface of the star, and you'll see a corresponding shadow migrate across the shape of this line. That's one of about 3 or 4 different types of corrupting signals that make it very difficult for us to discover these really small signals. So I think I've said most of this. We have a really well-motivated, challenging problem. The signal's about an order of magnitude smaller than the thing than what we can see. We have some hope. We know the characteristics of true Doppler shifts that distinguish them from stellar activity. It happens to the entire spectrum, not just particular lines or regions. The shapes are preserved. We know something about the time domain behavior. And there's been a lot of approaches already. I'm not the first person, my group isn't the first to try to attack this. People have honestly been working on this for a couple decades now. And there's classical techniques that involve trying to measure what we call indicators, which are proxies for these activity signatures, and then do some kind of decorrelation or perhaps model it in the time domain, or try to break up the spectrum and find the stellar lines that by chance are less sensitive to these effects. I'd like to also explore some of the ML and data-driven approaches. And so there's a couple approaches that have been tried so far. I think honestly, this is still a pretty wide open area. This is a really challenging yet rewarding domain of science. And we're just kind of starting to scratch the surface. So just to say briefly, Zoe de Beers and colleagues, others at MIT, including Andrew Vanderberg, have been working on neural networks. Yan and collaborators have been working on autoencoders. And so I'm going to invite Yan up to spend 1 or 2 minutes telling you in detail about her approach. And so we hope that this will excite.
Thank you for the perfect introduction. Hello, I'm Yan. I'm a final year graduate student at Princeton University. I have a talk tomorrow, so if you're interested, please come see me at the talk. So recently, our group has been working on this Astro architecture, which is essentially just an autoencoder for representing stellar activity at the full spectrum level. So our input and outputs are both full spectrum. Starting with the spectrum, we will compress it by an encoder to a very low dimensional representation. For us, it's just a 3-dimensional latent vector. And then the decoder will be used to expand it into a full rest frame activity spectrum that hopefully contains all the perturbations to the spectral lines. And we also have a neural network RV estimator that takes a full spectrum and measures its radial velocity. And we will combine the rest frame model with the RV estimate to create a reconstruction of the input spectrum. To train this network, we have 2 objectives. We want to make sure the reconstructed spectrum always matches the input spectrum. So we have a high fidelity model. And we also want to make sure our RV estimator is self-consistent in the sense that whenever we inject some artificial Doppler shift, it can correctly tell us the velocity offset that we injected in first place. It's just a brief overview. If you have questions, I'm happy to meet after this.
Great. Thank you. That was great. One should step. It's more that it's a change in shape of the lines, and therefore the centroid of the line shifts, and what we measure are the centroids of the lines. But because we're measuring something that's at about a part in 10 to the 4 level, a subtle change in shape shows up as a centroid shift. So there's about 3 or 4 physical effects that cause this. Let me show the one which I think is maybe the most cartoonish and easy to understand. So if we look at a single stellar line, the intensity as a function of wavelength that has this characteristic shape here, and the decrement in intensity on this side of the line corresponds to particular parts of the velocity field of the star. So if you cover up those velocity fields, like with a dark spot, you will put a little dent in this line, and the centroid of this line will shift over. So as the star spots rotate across the surface of the star, because the star is rotating as we see it, the average stellar lines will have these little bumps that kind of move through them on a time scale that's correlated with the physical rotational time scale. So, and that's an example of one that we can kind of understand. Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. This is a cartoon. I should also say we have great data because at night we use this new instrument to look at stars. During the day, we have a little 3-inch aperture that transports sunlight through an optical fiber down into the basement where this thing lives. So we can get hundreds of spectra of the sun per day, and we can also know that we're observing the same sun that spaceborne platforms are getting UV through infrared spectra and photometry of. So we have a good chance of connecting a model with some physical principles and a physical understanding.
Just technically on the autoencoder, what sort of autoencoder are you using, and how much stuff have you done on the latent space?
So I'm not using a variation autoencoder. I've not imposed any constraints on the distribution. It doesn't really matter if we do that or not, but personally, I feel like it's not well motivated to constrain the distribution of the stellar activity because we are not running like data generation on this anyways. And in another project with galaxy spectra, we found that if you do not impose like variational laws, instead you impose some physically or motivated laws, you can make the latent space have some nice structures or some nice properties. So we can use that space to do something that's physically motivated instead of just imposing some Gaussian prior.
Is there a reason why this is
It should just automatically.
let's try this. Okay. Okay, let me set my timer. Hi everyone, my name is Yisong. I'm a faculty in computing and mathematical sciences here at Caltech. And today I want to just spend a few minutes telling you about my thoughts on foundation models for science. So we are living in a very exciting time in the AI space. We started starting from about 10 years ago, this revolution in supervised learning, where if you have a large amount of labeled data, such as these densely annotated labels of urban scenes, you can feed that into an AI model using a method called supervised learning to produce these models that can make accurate predictions in the same output format as the input labels. And this is used in millions of self-driving cars these days. Over the last decade or so, there's been this shift towards requiring less and less human annotations because in many cases, they are very, very expensive to acquire, sometimes requiring expensive equipment. And so what you do there is you just take a large background data set that you believe shares some characteristics of the data set that you want to model, and you use what's called a self-supervised learning approach to learn this embedded. You could just think of this as a very complicated nonlinear encoding, such as a variation autoencoder, although there are other methods as well. And so you learn this embedding from a large background data set, which then you can use this embedding to more efficiently fine-tune unsupervised data. And the idea is that if you can do this well, then you could require, in some cases, an order of magnitude less annotated data or labeled data to be able to train a similarly accurate model. And then over the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years or so, there's been sort of this recognition of this concept called a foundation model. And what is a foundation model? A foundation model is a model trained on massive internet scale data and uses similar self-training, self-supervised pre-training approaches. A lot of the exciting successes have been in text-based foundation models, also known as large language models. And once you have these models, because they've been trained on such a large amount of data, you can actually design a decoder from these foundation models, not from training a model, but simply by adding an instruction in text. So anyone who has used ChatGPT has used this paradigm in action. So now instead of providing labels and training a model, you simply provide instructions. And so what has happened here, if you look at the animation that I just filled in the top of this slide, is that we have seen this trend towards increasingly more efficient task-specific decoding. Nowadays, if you want to build a decoder using various AI methods, you can, in some cases, just literally give textual instructions to a pre-trained model, and you have a decoder. So what are foundation models? So the definition is not completely clear. Different people mean slightly different things, but roughly speaking, a foundation model is a model that is easily reusable for many tasks, which means efficient adaptations, sometimes with just language instructions, sometimes with a very small training a very small decoder on a pre-trained embedding, sometimes with a small amount of fine-tuning. And people have made multiple different interpretations about why it's happening. People in mathematics of data science have tried to try to understand this, but the basic idea is now that we have these foundation models, you do not need to start from scratch. And I should just mention here that foundation models apply beyond language. Vision foundation models are also very popular, where you just take this large background image corpus, in this case, learn this embedding, and then you could use it to quickly decode many tasks. So for example, one of my colleagues here at Caltech, David Van Velen, BBE, uses these vision foundation models to quickly build, in this case, a very, very nuanced biomedical decoder. So here you see many different types of imaging modalities, many different species of animals from human, or life from humans to bacteria, and very accurate decoding and segmentation, decoding the segmentation of each individual cell. These type of technologies have the potential to dramatically accelerate the rate at which biomedical researchers can actually analyze this type of scientific data, because they produce symbolically interpretable concepts extracted from the raw data very efficiently. And so what I think is interesting in this space is to go from raw data, and here I'll just use pixels as a proxy for any kind of high-dimensional raw data, from raw data to semantic reasoning via hypothesis generation. And so, this has two steps, and I'll talk about the two steps in green and in this weird reddish orange color. Apologies. So let's just decompose this into two steps. The first step is to take high-dimensional raw data, pixels as a placeholder, and decode symbolically useful concepts like, for example, segmentations of cells. The second step is to use that vocabulary of symbolic concepts to search for novel hypotheses. And of course, when you build these systems to perform well at scale over complex hypothesis classes, there's going to be an interaction between these two steps that require end-to-end optimization. And those are the types of algorithms that I find interesting to design. And so just to give you just a flavor of the types of results we've developed so far, one example of step one is automatic key point extraction for behavior analysis. So this is now used across I don't want to say a number of that because I know this is being recorded, but let's just say many labs in neuroscience. For example, if you want to actually build hypotheses of videos of behavior, now these videos can be hours long at 30 frames per second. So some of these videos actually recorded not continuously over 4 days, which is approximately 100 million frames of images. And you want to build a scientific theory on the behavior of mice from these images. You have to track their key points across millions of frames. And so we've built an approach that can do this in a fully autonomous way without any human labels. The AI system just ingests the data and outputs these key points. And in fact, I should mention here that one exciting result here is this species of jellyfish. It's a new type of model organism being developed in biology, in neuroscience. And it's actually very hard to track, and no existing tracking system can track it. Our system was able to track it out of the box. 2 minutes. Oh, wow, I'm really out of time. Okay, so let me just go to the next step, which is laser, which is this work not by me, but by a visiting student in my lab, Atharva, who is visiting from UT Austin. And the basic idea is to do symbolic regression. So what is symbolic regression? It is given extracted concepts, build a theory from these symbolic concepts. So this is an animation from one of the leaders in this field, Miles Kramer. And the question is, can we do better? And the way we do better is by using foundation models to inject common knowledge into these formal ideas to accelerate the search over symbolic hypotheses. So for example, if this is something that is a common knowledge within a certain domain, how do we actually inject it into this search process over a combinatorial large hypothesis space? And the basic idea is that you have this complex search diagram. These blue boxes are where these foundation models accelerate the search. And I think I will close there since I'm out of time and just leave this slide up. Thank you for your attention. It's all out of distribution. Or I don't know, let me be careful what I say. We've done out of distribution evaluations. I don't remember if that image screenshot was out of distribution or not, but we've done out of distribution evaluation. The kind of image. Yeah, so these things are hard to measure. You know, what does it mean to be kind of in the data set? So for example, I spent 2 years in self-driving, and things that you think are in distribution are actually out of distribution because it's such a high dimensional space. So it's an area of active research in the, I would say, in things that I'm interested in is how do you actually quantify whether it's in distribution or not in these high dimensional spaces? So, you know, one person can argue it's in distribution, another person can argue it's out. Yeah. Yeah. Raw observational data. Yeah. No, the idea, since you asked, let me go into an actual. The idea is that in the past, the human directly interacts with the raw data. And at least in the field of behavioral neuroscience that I've collaborated with the most, that is so mind-numbingly time-consuming that PhD students might even drop out. Because you're literally watching hours of videos of mice interacting with each other and labeling at 30 frames per second what is happening in that frame. And so that's what happens in the past. And what the paradigm that I'm suggesting is that you pop the human interaction between the human expert and the entire computational modeling up multiple levels of abstraction, where you are just programming using your domain knowledge, using logical instructions, and these foundation models are able to convert that and compile it into the kind of loss functions you want to build the representations you want. So you don't need to label, or I mean, ideally you don't need to label at all, but of course, you know, it takes a while to get there. Yes. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but roughly speaking, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. For sure. For sure. For sure. I don't have a slide here. We've applied these ideas to, for example, medical monitoring. Like, for example, if you can apply this to, like, for example, EKG, which is maybe, you know, not exactly the same, but it's a one-dimensional time series of your heart, a monitoring of your heart. And we've applied these ideas there. I think what's interesting here is that high dimension, what is high dimensional depends on like what you care about. So for example, if you have a really high resolution time series, such as the spectra that you described, dimensionality there affects, you can think of each individual bucket of wavelength as a dimension, right? In that case, even though it's a nominally one-dimensional time series, it's actually, you know, a million dimensional. Yes. So that depends on the system. Yeah, so I would just say it depends on the system. Sometimes that is very beneficial. Other times it's not, in the sense that you want to just have a system that you've designed and then you freeze it and then you apply it. Okay. It might be better to take this offline. The honest answer is that this is obviously a work in progress. Like some of the stuff that I've described is aspirational. Maybe that was maybe a little bit lost here. Some of the stuff I described is aspirational versus stuff we've already done. And so what you're asking for is stuff that it's work in progress. I'm happy to talk to you offline, but it's a bit more nuanced than what I can answer in a soundbite. Yeah. Thank you.
That means I'm the only thing standing between you and coffee. Hopefully there is coffee out there. Okay, so I'm going to talk about multi-messenger astronomy, which is a very broad topic, and there's lots of things. So this is going to be very much just a very simple overview. If my screen stops flashing here. Oh, that's interesting. Yes. It's trying to project on. Nope. I don't know what's going on. Because I know this one has already worked, right? There we go. Okay. Yeah, but I've already connected this machine up 3 times to this system. So, okay. So very brief overview on multi-messenger astronomy. So again, it's one of those areas of astronomy which has already produced a Nobel Prize, which is essentially for LIGO. But the Astro 2020 Decadal Survey identified new messengers, new physics as one of the 3 key themes of this decade. And there's an increasing amount of activity and effort within Astro for MMA. The basic goal of multi-messenger astronomy is to look for counterparts to alerts or triggers coming from some other instrument or facility, probably operating not necessarily even in the electromagnetic regime. It may be gravitational waves, it might be high energy particles, it might be neutrinos, something like that. So we receive a notification from facility A that they've detected something in some large region of sky maybe, and then there's this concerted effort to try and see if there are other detections of the same phenomena that they have identified in, pick your wavelength of choice or your detector of choice or whatever. So it really is, how many ways can we identify the same thing, or how can I get the most bang for my buck, where bang is the thing I want to find because it's probably explosive. So what's important is also that, you know, Sri Kulkarni has this formula that the discovery rate is hardware times software times grayware, and you're talking about very expensive instruments and a whole load of detection software and whatever, and a lot of people working on it. So we should get really high discovery rates, or a lot of survey astronomy, particularly some of the projects that we're working on here at Caltech, and Mansley Kazee World is particularly leading some of them, times the analytics, times the talent, should mean we should be discovering lots of good things. In terms of describing the problem space, the 3 primary tasks that you undertake when you're doing analysis of MMA data is you're looking for detection, in the sense that I've detected something in this band, and how do I detect the same thing amongst a data set that's coming from another band? can I characterize all those things that I've detected, which may be the thing, or can I characterize this new thing that I think I've seen, maybe only never seen before? It could be some new rare form of thing. And can I characterize it enough so that I know what it might look like in another way of looking at it? And can I infer maybe what it's going to be doing and that sort of thing? And the main challenges as well are speed, because a lot of the facilities we use, they're taking either data at a high rate or they're looking at phenomena that are very short-lived. So there's that problem. There's a problem of minimal information, and that I may only have 1 or 2 observations of this thing in band A or band B, and I want to try and maximize what I can predict about it so I can make intelligent forecasting. And obviously, if I'm also going to be doing follow-up observations, in the sense I've detected this, I've detected a possible kilonova, I want to see what the optical look like, I need a very low false positive rate, so that I'm not crying wolf all the time, and I actually, when I do take an observation or whatever, it's a genuine thing. So the other thing is MMA is about as fast. I mean, it's fast astronomy in the sense, I mean, our timescales are very slow compared to other sciences where these sorts of things are critical, like high energy physics or neuroscience. But still for astronomy, it is fast in that we are talking about things where maybe our phenomena are happening on timescales of, seconds or minutes. And also our response time might need to be minutes or hours, rather than, oh, I saw this thing go off and 20 years later, I'm going to get a spectrum of it because I want to see if it's still interesting. It's much more constrained than that. So our latency requirements at the moment, in terms of where ZTF is, or IceCube or LIGO, are, that's sort of the same as a Netflix 4K, and the data volume isn't coming down. But the next generation surveys like DUNE, which is going to be doing neutrino experiments or neutrino detections, astrophysical neutrinos, they're beginning to move into the LHC realm. And so obviously there are problems there that are relevant for sorts of things they're interested in doing. There are other things as well, like some of the survey satellites, like this is test data of a supernova, and it got a very, very quick shock breakout, which was expected. And this is beautiful data for identifying this sort of thing. And again, the ability to track this and get onto it and identify these things is really important. So let me just walk through an example. So this is a LIGO event. This is the sort of data that we get from LIGO in astronomy. It's a sky map. This is quite a good localization from LIGO in that we know that something happened within those 260 square degrees that are marked in orange. In this case, it was probably some sort of neutron star merger with something else, which is particularly interesting to some people. And so what we do is we would go then, okay, so here's our initial trigger. Let's see what's happened in the optical in that regime to see if we can see an EM counterpart to the gravitational wave event we've detected. And so what we'll get is we'll get a new detection of something, and we have a reference image. We can take one away from the other, and we get some photometry points. So there's a change of brightness. So this might be some sort of flaring that's associated with that one, or this one might be as well. And actually what we end up with is, in 260 square degrees, we may end up with several thousand of candidates, which we then need to filter down. And so what we need to do is we sort of need to try and identify each source and say what it is. Now, one of the problems is if we have too few data points, the type of classification we can do is going to be it's going to be very basic in just saying, is this a transient or is this a variable? Maybe we have prior history to say this sort of thing does lots of variability, so we can throw it out. This thing's never been anything, there's a new data point. Maybe we have some more data points, some more information, and we think we can do more detailed classification. So one of the problems we have in this field is that we have time-based classification. The next thing is what might happen next. Okay, and let me assume that I think I have this. Can I make a forecast with low error bars and where I think this is going next, so I might be able to inform myself about what I want to do next? is this thing going to be useful? Is this thing going to behave in the fashion that I think it is because I'm after one particular type of thing? And then there's the question of what should we do next? So let's say that I think this is a kilonova, but how am I going to confirm that? Well, maybe I've got, a rich resource on a cheap resource A, or I've got less availability on a more expensive resource, or maybe there's something which gives me a different type of information, or I could do nothing. Which is the type of activity that I want to do with this particular source, which would allow me to identify whether what I want to do is useful or not, which gives me the most information gain, maybe not just for what I'm doing now, but for some overall strategy. So really, there's a lot of, given this information and given what I want to do, what is the decision I need to make next, and how do I do this in an optimal way? So really the problem is, and also humans are really bad at making decisions. We want to take them out of the loop because we want to be unbiased, we want to have scalability, and we want to have speed. So how do I do this? How do I do this autonomous resource allocation? And maybe according to some optimal strategy, which takes into account all possible future allocations and future outcomes to allow me to identify the sorts of things that I'm interested in identifying. And so that's one of the main problems that we're thinking about in MMA, and I'll leave it there. Happy to take a question or two. None. Good. Okay, so I think in that case, let's hope there's coffee out there, and we'll break until, when do we come back? 3:45. So we actually have a nice 30-minute coffee break for discussion and such.
I'm gonna just check it plugs in, okay. Yeah, it makes it so much easier. Does it go? 2 years ago. Oh, yeah, that's fine. Okay, I don't know.
So you're going to get one more computer. No, actually, we've got the computer. So what we're going to do is that Katie was supposed to be having the last, she'll be moving up to fill the development spot, and then we'll have 15 minutes for panel discussion, or maybe Okay, next up is Georgia.
Okay, great. So I have a presentation. I am a new faculty here, so I want to present mostly who I am and what I work on, and also some thoughts on how I think we should be approaching the transdisciplinary field of machine learning. You might disagree with me, and also you might not like what I say, so please say that, because I think it's a discussion rather than one. Okay, so very quickly, I did this introductory, even though no one else has done this, so now I feel kind of weird, but I was born in Greece, got my PhD at UC Berkeley, and then after I got my PhD, I spent a few years, 6 years at Meta as a research scientist there. And then 1.5 years ago, something like that, I moved to Caltech, where, oh, yes, okay. Yes, I will try to do that. Where I am working on AI and computer vision. So what do I do? And so I think in one sentence, what I like to do and how I like to spend my time, and I do this maybe like 50% of the time because the rest goes in whatever else. But what I mostly like to do is I like to build methods that try to solve new problems. And so for the first, I've been working on computer vision and trying to build methods that solve problems for 15 years. And maybe the first 7 years of what I was trying to do can be actually encapsulated in this video, where what I'm showing you is this method that we built that takes in an image, any image as input, and can discover and localize objects that can tell you what they are and with what confidence. It can also segment out people and detect their poses in either sparse or dense way. And it can also segment out, not just localize objects as a silhouette, as a box, but also mark their exact silhouette. So that actually took a while to get right. And that was around 2017 when we got this result. And it was very clear that, okay, we have a solution, we have a recipe to this problem. And my work was actually trying to figure out those ingredients that would make this solution possible. And also, so that is when it was made clear that we have a solution and we could make it even better, maybe if you scaled it up, bigger models and more data. And this is exactly what happened 6 years after this work with the project Segment Anything. But at that time, we felt that this was a good enough result. And so I started asking a different question that really intrigued me and intrigues me to this day because there isn't a good solution for it. And the question is, can we actually make machines recognize objects no longer in 2D, like the work I showed you before, but make the leap from images to 3D understanding? So image is the input, but now I want to understand the world with its objects in 3 dimensions. A very difficult problem. And so I threw myself into exactly answering this question that has led to a number of projects trying to do exactly that. So you see projects that go from a few images to 3D, all the way to 1 image to 3D, and also video to 3D of complex scenes. This is an unsolved problem still. We're very far to have an actually good solution for this. But even the process of trying to solve these problems, we had to figure out how we're going to do this. And one realization that we came to, and which is what I wanted to present to you because it's very important, is that learning with images is easy. Actually, it's not easy. It was made easy because of 3 contributions that are very much valued in the field of ML, and I hope other scientific disciplines also adopted that. First of all, we have libraries like PyTorch that allow you to work with machine learning and deep learning models without you needing to understand CUDA, how a memory works, what a RAM is, what a CPU is, nothing. You can just go in and directly work with deep learning without really knowing the guts of any of the systems. That is a fantastic ability to have, and you should be very grateful. And there is 300 engineers working on that, on enabling that and giving this to you. Then we have all the researchers that are developing these neural nets and better architectures. With some of these contributions is what Hopfield and Hinton were awarded for, and Jan LeCun with the Turing Award, et cetera. And then we have another contribution, which is large-scale data that was also provided, that was also collected, part of an academic effort to facilitate learning from data. So that was learning from images. It was made easy through years of contribution that are actually being recognized as we speak. But this is not really sufficient for 3D. So we had to kind of figure out what it is that we need to bring to the table to make 3D learning happen. And so we kind of followed the same route. So the first thing we wanted to provide is tooling so that to enable 3D learning. First of all, we needed tooling for ourselves. But we also figured that we're going to do the deed, the good deed, and making it available to other people. And so we developed this library that we open sourced that kind of bridges deep learning and 3D data structures. 3D data structures are great, but you need to actually make something extra to allow differentiating through them. And this is exactly what the library provides, which was an engineering feat and also a problem-solving feat to make work. And I'm not going to play the whole video because it gets kind of intricate and complicated. So that was the first thing that was needed. Then we also needed to develop large data for 3D. This is an ongoing effort, which we had this exciting new data set on over 10 million 3D objects that is, I think, has been downloaded something like 120,000 times, according to Matt, the first author recently. That is great, and that has spearheaded a lot of new results in 3D. So this problem of going from images to 3D is certainly something that is informing my current agenda that I'm working on here at Caltech with my students. But we're also in this new era of AI where we have these new tools. And so that means new ideas to make this happen. So Matt said I have 2 minutes. So I'm not going to go into the project that I'm working on because I actually wanted to share some other thoughts with you. And my thoughts are going to be on how to make progress in ML and Astro. And this is from the point of view of an AI researcher. So the first thing is that someone like me, and I will speak for myself only, my focus is on core AI. And we're in this era where there's so much happening that it consumes all of my time. I want to be on top of what's happening and what's the new technology that's being developed. I want to understand what GPT-4 is, how to train it, how to fine-tune it, how to make it work. That is a lot of things that I need to do. And I read papers, I also try to code. So pretty much I have time to do nothing else. So if I wanted to work in ML and Astro, there is a problem here because I don't have the time to actually invest in learning more about Astro. This is a hard reality, but I think it's a reality that we need to be faced with. Okay, so this is me every day trying to catch up. The other thing is that, okay, then we need to hire maybe more people that can be at the interface of ML and Astro. Yes, and I got to realize recently that ML and Astro, it's actually a growing field. It's not as densely occupied as other areas. For example, I was in the search committee last year for CMS, and there was one application of a person that applied for faculty in ML and Astro. Okay, so it's not very densely occupied, so there aren't a lot of people working on it. Then the question is, how can we make progress in a scalable way? How can we actually bring these two worlds together to do meaningful research. And to me, we need to actually open our perspectives on what it means to contribute in this transdisciplinary fields. So there's two modes of operation in research. One is, this is you, the researcher. You have a problem that you're trying to attack, which is this big wall. And what you're doing is that you're trying to launch yourself over that wall. You try to solve that problem that's actually very difficult, which is why you're in grad school. And so the hope is that you can actually make this happen. This is how the majority of all of the fields operate. In machine learning, people have discovered that there's another way to make contributions, and that is to lower the wall, to lower the barrier of entry so that more people can work on these problems. And so as a result, a researcher has to do a small actual step to solve problems, but also the added benefits, like you get more people to work on. So what I'm trying to say is that we should actually invite contributions of the latter form, of lowering the barrier of entry to do research. And so I see this as making contribution in 4 different ways, which we start to value more and more. And I know I'm over time by now, so I'm going really quickly. The first is actually trying to formulate some of the problems in Astro in the most abstract general ways possible. This is actually very difficult, and I invite you to form some of the problems that you're working on in Astro as ML or mathematical problems, and you'll see that it's becoming very hard. And it's an undervalued contribution, and I think we should value it. If there is a PhD thesis that does only this, to me, that's a very good PhD thesis. We also need to open source easy to use tools and reproducible tools. Research needs to have code out that you can run and reproduce results. It also needs libraries and tools so that people can actually quickly hack together solutions. If this doesn't exist, then you're asking from every PhD student to reinvent the wheel, and that's simply not going to scale. We need data sets and benchmarks, tasks defined with very clear metrics that we can measure progress. And last, we need to develop and release baselines. Some initial ideas, not the state of the art, they don't have to solve a problem. Frankly, none of the problems that we're working on, none of the solutions solve any problem. We're just making a small added contribution, small added plus to a specific problem. And we need to release those so that people can have an idea how to apply models and how to put them together to solve this problem. So this is mostly what I wanted to say today. I think that these are all things that the AI community is doing very well because it is actually valuing all of these contributions. I'm not going to be surprised if in 10 years from now, the Turing Award goes actually to PyTorch. So I think that this is going to be one of those things that if other scientific disciplines also adopted, we would see a lot more progress, accelerated progress, and more scalable progress. And it would also invite more grad students to work on it. So controversial takes, I don't know if you agree, disagree, but that's what I wanted to say. Thank you. And if you want to reach out about research or also like, these philosophical thoughts, please do.
I think the other thing about the abstraction is that allows you, there's the commonality of the solution. And once you've abstracted the main problem into the the mathematical, then you go, oh right, oh that's that, and I can apply that there, and it's that translation. I think no, I mean I agree, and I would like to see an astronomy paper where the premise of the paper is we're going to take this thing, this is the abstraction of it, and then that's it. We don't have the solution, but there's the math to taking the interesting.
Read that paper and understand it more than
Yeah.
those other.
Good. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Fans discipline.
The question is, what makes the more
Great question. I don't really know. My worry with one person going to do everything is that they're going to be mediocre or two things rather than necessarily one thing. But I think that if we were successfully able to lower the barrier of entry for both fields, and I think that now in Astro that's not the case. Frankly, I was able to understand maybe 50% of the Astro presentation. Maybe I'm stupid. As I said, I only have time to go in one thing and be good at one thing. So if we were able to lower both barriers of entry, and I think I'm now doing a good job of lowering the barrier of entry to the point where it's being dismissed by many as not doing science, but very wrong, because we actually have to do the barrier of entry. It seems simple. If Astro succeeded in that, then I could see one person do both things and very good. But if the barrier of entry is as high as it is right now, and I hope something like that, then I think it's going to be very good. Actually, for me, it's going to be very difficult to see actual fundamental.
I think that's a very good point. But, and machine learning challenges or data challenges may be a way to get that lowering barrier.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, next up, Ashish.
Hello, I'm going to talk of time domain astronomy, which has been going on for a long time and the amounts of data are really large. So some of the things that Georgia was mentioning, maybe they already apply to this because here are some of the problems where we can be using CS techniques already and we have some low hanging fruit benchmarks and so on. And I represent the work of many, many here. I won't be able to mention all the names. So in fact, I'll be restricting myself to some optical astronomy, photometric astronomy. I won't be talking of spectra, etc. Though those are very important component of time domain astronomy when it comes to classifications. And we started a lot of this time domain astronomy related things here with TPOS about 25 years ago. And then we have made progression through various other sky surveys. And right now it's ZTF data, so I'll be concentrating on that a little bit, where we have got billions of sources. And these sources are in multiple filters. And there are hundreds to thousands of points per source. So the amount of data is really large. And we can easily cull out parts from this to do lots and lots of different things. So if you look at this diagram here, you can see that on the axis there, you can see that there are 2,000 plus points for many sources. And then if you look at the table there, the columns indicate how many sources you have and how many points they have. So if you want a single point, there are more than 4 billion sources. But then if you go to the rightmost column, you see that if you require there to be at least 20 points, then it reduces to 2.7 billion, which is not small in any way. But that 20 number is interesting because there are a small number of sources where which would have fewer points. So not all of the points are above the detection limits. What that means is that our data are really sparse. And that's one of the key points that we have in trying to solve these problems with various things. So the variety of data is also among us. There are hundreds of classes and subclasses. You see here two diagrams. One shows with respect to motion of objects, and one shows with respect to the change in brightness that is intrinsic, how there are many, many subclassifications possible. And then you can do phenomenological and ontological classifications also, and you can keep on going down and down as much as you want. You start at the topmost level asking whether a particular source is variable or not within the detection limits or error bars that you have. And it turns out that within our lifetimes, about 80% of the objects that we see to the detection limits that we currently see are not going to change much. So that leaves 20%, but 20% of 1 billion is going to be a very large number as well. So we leave out the non-variables, and then we ask whether a particular variable source is periodic or not. And then there are many stochastic sources, and then there are irregular sources. That's my break time. And semi-regular sources. And then there are transient sources. Transients, Matthew already talked about at least a subset of those where we need to really go to the sky quickly and try to figure out what those are with some follow-up observing so that we get to the physics of it. But a large number of sources are these static, relatively static sources, but still varying, which we need to understand their physics of as well. So really lots of things. So here is a Zenodo link where a large number of ZTF fields, ZTF looks at the entire northern sky, several hundred, and a large fraction of them with classifications are already available there. So these are not exactly like a benchmark because we don't have every last bit of data there, but we have enough classifications there. We have lots of features that we have derived from these light curves that are already there. And so what are the problems that we have? The data are really gappy. They're not just gappy, but the gaps are irregular and they're heteroscedastic. Each point can have a slightly different error bar, and we need to deal with that. So when I talked about those objects with 20 points, remember that those 20 points were from 5 years. Most of them have hundreds, but even hundreds points over 5 years is really sparse. And we need to, so we have been using some CS techniques. Like what you see here is we were able to convert a time series taking pairs of points and converting it into a DMDT diagram, essentially a 2D histogram, which then we could look up as images and use CNN with that. So CNN was the most attractive hammer at that time. We converted our problem into a nail and started using that hammer with it. And now there are, of course, other things like transformers and so on that we'd like to use. So what you see on the right-hand side are essentially that. You can do feature-based classification on any of these, irregular or almost regular or regular, but also you have a lot of zero-shot foundation model possibilities. And that's something that one could be using there. And so what are the tasks that we are looking at? Classification, obviously, because that's something that will tell us, start putting things into different bins. But then as you do classification, you come across anomalies. Again, partly because of the sparse data, et cetera. And I contend that each anomaly is really tip of an iceberg. So it's waiting for the entire iceberg to be discovered. And so those tell us about what more things we can be looking at, what are the features that we should be looking at. And then that is what also takes us to physical parameters, understanding of those. Again, in astronomy, there have been many recent areas where people have started using that, especially things like variational autoencoders. You take something like spectra and images and try to come up with a space. And with variational autoencoders, you not only look at those pairings, but look at the entire space and come up with standard deviations and so on. So you can generate new spectra and start associating them with the different classes, etc. So things have been going on. And with anomalies in ZTF, for instance, we have been looking at multiple classifiers using not only our original XGBoost and DNN, but also HDB scan and isolation forest to understand what may be outliers and looking at all of those to bring them to, again, looking at the distributions of what we have seen as classes, but also what are the gaps in that. And it is exactly those gaps also that we are starting to analyze better now, because if you look at ZTF data in a night, there are of the order of 100,000 alerts that we get, but then many individual or smaller teams look at all these and start looking at subsets of those, and finally the number of spectra that get taken are of the order of a dozen. So what is it, where are we going from this 100,000 to a dozen? That's what the Fritz or analysis, the frigate thing that you see at the bottom here is trying to do, from a full nights of data, how to get to the filtered data set and understanding what is it that astronomers are leaving out. We have also been looking at many different distance measures to see if that is something that's going to help us with classification. But clearly there are more possibilities out there. Here is a slide from Jeffrey Fox at the IEEE SMACIT Foundation Models meeting that we had recently. So the number of possible foundation models just for time series are really large. Many of them are using transformers. There are some older ones also, but most of them use regular time series. Otherwise, you need to start interpolating them, and that is where the problems can really come in. So we do have time series, we have billions of time series, and that is where we really need more help as to how we can use them meaningfully with the current or upcoming foundation models to be able to do these classifications, do anomaly detections, and link it to the physics, of course. So I had a student who worked with some out-of-the-box models. There was a little bit of success, but again, what we really need is, again, if there is some CSL that could come through saying that, oh, this is the thing that you should be changing slightly, or this is what you could be doing. And for this particular thing, for time series, we do have data sets that are available. So as Georgia was saying, that's something that we can make progress on small, short time scales, I think. I'll leave with that. Where do we go from here and how we can combine with CS and Astro thing? And if there are questions, I will take those. Yeah, so with biomedical, the biggest difficulty is that they have very good data and their data sets have been getting larger and larger. The trouble there has been more about the de-identification part and getting things out and working with those. And they, in fact, in some cases have even sparser data. So they, of course, can do additional tests and look it up, which is not available. So things there have been slowly improving, even if there are those, how can I say, silos that are there. And so for instance, with breast cancer data, one group has done 3 different tests, 3 different programs that they had. Each had a slightly different outcome. And now they're starting to combine those very slowly. So those possibilities do exist out there. And there are a few things that we can learn from there, where CS people are very interested in those kinds of things, because of course, if you solve a health problem, you're going to get immediate lots of different possibilities, unlike astronomy data, which are, as has been said, a long time, worthless or costless. But slowly there have been advances there, and there are no specific individual lessons I say I can bring from there. But again, data sets that have been built there have been very useful to do that. Again, just like we have experienced in astronomy and CS before, the biggest problem, even bigger problem than astronomy and CS, was a commonality of vocabulary. So coming up with terms that were used very differently, and coming to the same terms was the biggest challenge. But once you do that, right, exactly. But for that, what has been happening is that because again, there is a lot of money in that, far more money than in astronomy. These things that have been run by NIH, those have been quite successful. So for instance, the EDRN collaboration I'm in, there's a meeting that happens every 3 months, and there are 40 to 100 people, same number of people coming together again and again and discussing these. And they do invite experts from outside who speak about things and so on. So that's the kind of thing that has been working there. Yeah. Yeah, again, I think for the simplest problem, that's really true. That's why you see so many papers or at least news items coming, oh, cancer has been solved now, or things like that, right, using latest things. And then if you start going deeper, then you see that it's only a subset of things that has been done. But again, maybe that's what has been happening, that the low, you bring down the barrier lower enough so that some can be crossed. Yes, true.
Hey, hi everyone. Yeah, it's really exciting to have this. Thanks for coming, and I hope some new fruitful collaborations come out of this. So I'm going to talk about seeing beyond the blur by leveraging machine learning to image with increasingly strong assumptions. So I want to talk a little bit about what my group does more generally. So I like to work on imaging like the invisible, where we can't take pictures with normal traditional cameras. And this is, for instance, in many applications, we just are talking about medical imaging where you can't use a camera, and so you have to come up with some other kinds of sensing system that gives us measurements that don't look like the image at all that we were trying to capture. But by understanding those measurements, we can develop algorithms that allow us to recover back the desired picture. And of course, this isn't just true in medical imaging, but in a range of many different applications, an area that I like to call computational imaging. And so this is my primary area of interest, and I work on lots of problems, both in astronomy and not astronomy. So here are some non-astronomy ones that I've worked on. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can use machine learning in an area that, I'm going to embrace my internet Christian nickname of the black hole girl and discuss what we're doing to study these invisible beasts even more with machine learning. So as some of you might know, these are the two images of the first black hole images of the black hole Sagittarius star in our Milky Way, and M8, the one in the center of the M87 galaxy. And taking these pictures took hundreds of people working together, part of the Event Horizon Telescope collaboration, because these pictures are of objects that are so small, about the same size as if you had a grain of sand in New York, and we're viewing it from all the way where we are now. Yet probably the most common question that I get is not related to any science or anything related to these images, but instead, why are these images so blurry? And the answer really comes down to the fact that to make these images possible, we needed to build a virtual Earth-sized telescope. And to get any more resolution, we would have to build a virtual telescope that's even bigger than the Earth. So in other words, we'd have to go to space. And so, that's one possible direction, but it's expensive and it's years away. So one question my group has been asking is, can we try to see more with the data we currently have? And so the black hole images that I showed you assume that we had very weak assumptions about the image formation process And that was good because in the initial images, we wanted to not have we didn't want to bias our picture too much. We wanted to say, really test our theory if this radio source that we were looking at is a black hole, or what does a black hole look like. But once we've kind of built up our confidence that this is likely to be a black hole, and it seems to align with what our expected physics is telling us, could we start imposing some of this physics into the problem, again, to enhance our images? And that's what we've been working on in my group, some of the directions we've been working on, leveraging machine learning to add increasingly strong assumptions to try to see past that blur. And so I'll briefly discuss just 2 works along this direction today. They're in the context of black hole imaging, but I hope you'll see that these ideas kind of extend beyond that as well. So the first is doing image reconstruction with data-driven priors. So let's consider different types of reconstruction methods. So we get this noisy, sparse data from our telescopes, and we need to recover a picture. So on the left side with traditional imaging, which uses kind of traditional handcrafted regularizers, we want to make as few assumptions as possible. And on the right-hand side, model fitting, which constitutes when we have like a physical model or a geometric model, and we're trying to solve for the parameters of that model that best fit our data. So these are kind of the 2 extremes of that people typically think about when they're trying to analyze image data. But both of these have problems. So on the left side, the problem is, okay, it's good because it doesn't bias us too much, and we can get surprising new structure. There's, it leaves the potential for discovery, but it's very limiting in what we can, you don't get these rich images. And model fitting limits the potential of discovery and is prone to overfitting to an incorrect model. So we want to target kind of the middle between these 2 extremes. And to do that, we've been proposing to use data-driven priors to fill in the rest of the spectrum. So if we could try to flexibly design a prior, like inject information about what images should look like into the inverse problem, maybe we can see how that would affect the different images. So for instance, we can generate training data sets of images with different target visual statistics, and then use those, train a data-driven prior that we then use in the inverse problem. So for instance, these images on the bottom were generated using different data-driven priors that were just assuming different types of images, that they should have different kind of visual statistics. For instance, the middle one is assuming that it came from, has a similar statistics to what black hole simulations look like. And so these all are actually fitting the data, but you can see they all look different from one another because of those different image assumptions that go into them. In fact, my favorite example is using a celebrity face prior to reconstruct the black hole image. So these are actually reconstructions of the M87 image. And you can see you get this like Phantom of the Opera-esque mask, which, it's, obviously this is an absurd prior that we should use faces to reconstruct a black hole. But what this kind of helps us do is identify what is real features and what are just caused due to the image assumptions we make. And so we've been exploring a whole suite of methods in my group that allow us to tackle this problem. Methods that allow us to plug an image generation model, such as a diffusion model, into any inverse problems. And that not only gives us flexibility to impose rich physical constraints, but also allows us to capture the full posterior, so the uncertainty. And this is in a plug-and-play fashion, so not just black hole imaging, but kind of lots of different problems. Okay, I only have a little bit of time left, so we want to also see, I want to mention how we want to also, can we push this even further? If, for instance, we don't know just what the images look like in a statistical sense, but for instance, you trust general relativity, then what can you do? Well, it turns out in this case, you can actually pop out of the 2D image plane and even recover what's happening around the black hole in 3 dimensions over time. And how is this possible? Well, by adding strong physical constraints into the problem. You can do this by actually taking the light curve data of a black hole, adding in these strong physical constraints, and see how you would have expected gas moving in 3 dimensions around the black hole. And so this absolutely sounds kind of crazy. It's like taking, you know, a movie, summing up all the pixels, the RGB, and playing them as a single time series, and then not just trying to reconstruct the movie back again, but actually the 3D structure of the characters. And although that is absolutely crazy, because in our case we have these really strong physical constraints that we can impose about the motion, the light bending, and the polarization of the light, this actually becomes possible, and we can recover not just the location of where a single hot spot might be around a black hole, but actually a whole volumetric representation. And so here, like what I'm trying to get across is the physical constraints are really what makes it possible. So how can we do that? Well, I don't kind of have time to get into details, but by using neural network representations of the volume, we have access to a continuous and differentiable representation that makes adding in these kind of different physical constraints a lot easier. And so then we can train the parameters of our volume, which is represented as a neural network, using just standard machine learning toolboxes. And doing that, we've actually been able to recover even what the emission looks like around a black hole in 3D around the Sagittarius star black hole. So I'm going to just, I know I'm over time, so I'm just going to kind of skip through this and just say, before ending, I also want to just say, I think everyone here probably believes this, but you know, how much of it is, there's a two-way street between science and algorithms, and how important it is that we go both directions. So for instance, the scientifically motivating task of mapping what a flare looks like around a black hole led us to develop a method that leveraged modern computer vision methods, but incorporated a physical gravitational lensing into them. And in the process of doing that, we actually realized that this could be useful for other kinds of problems too. For example, the problem of mapping dark matter in our universe. And so this is something that we've recently also been working on with a very similar kind of representation here. So with that, I'll end, and I feel like I don't need to say it, but I urge everyone to come at these problems from both directions, because I think it really does push the boundaries of both directions. So thanks. Well, I mean, it depends. So I showed the example of the one that was black hole simulations, and these were actually the top two right ones are different black hole simulations and how they lead to slightly different reconstructions, but it doesn't have to be a simulation. On the left, we have natural images that are just downscaled so you can't see it. So yeah, I mean, it could be a simulation but it's just image data, where the data is an image driven priors. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so these are all, you collect a data set of images, whether that's from a simulation or natural, or images that you've actually just taken, and you want to like learn kind of the correlations and the pixels. And well, I think that, yeah, I mean, maybe I think we could come up with a better name, but I think it is supposed to be, you know, like data driven as opposed to hand derived mathematical equations. So it takes collections of images and tries to recover. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, this, like in all of these problems, well, first of all, for all these problems, you want to try to avoid overfitting, but anytime you have a problem where you have the sparse, noisy data, you're going to bias your solution by your prior, right? So the point is that in normal kind of regularizers where they're hand derived, it's really hard to separate what came from your prior assumptions and what is from the data. And so I think the goal that we were trying to do here is, okay, well, we can't get away from hallucinating, you know, to answer kind of the question that someone asked before. But what we can do is try to recover under different types of hallucination and try to figure out what is the common structure that appears and what is different. And it allows us to tease out, you know, what is okay, it's maybe not overfit exactly, but what is hallucinated versus what is real. Yeah, yeah. And then as far as overfitting, there's like other ways that we can kind of assess that. Yeah. The different types of physics that we imposed in there is the bending of the light. So assume in this work we assumed we knew the mass of the black hole. We did search over the spin, and then the physics. We were far enough out that we assumed Keplerian orbit, and then also synchrotron emission. So I guess these were all hard constraints, although it would be interesting in the future to solve for some of the parameters of this. Yeah. Yeah, well, if you get close, like we did look at like sub-Keplerian orbits and stuff, but if you get too close, then you start to have problems, right? Yeah. Yeah, great question. So first of all, this is an insanely ill-posed problem, right? We're going from a light curve to not even just an image, but a movie in 3D, right? So it's like, but I'm trying to highlight how like, if you having those physical constraints, it's actually possible. And in our paper, we show how if you reinitialize the network, you get slightly different solutions. We always did seem to get this structure of two, but this is actually the average of many, but you did see like these two spots in roughly the same location, but the exact, just like with the black hole, the exact pixel values is not known, but there are some features that seem to be pretty consistent. Of course, all of this is subject to you believing those constraints, right? So yeah. Yeah, I would more say, well, these are not really robust like those things. And then those blobs, like the shape of them slightly can change. It's like, but there are roughly blobs in the two blobs in those locations. Yeah. Oh, well, I guess you could, if you assume some physics, then, and you recover something, is the stuff that you didn't assume still aligning with the physics? I guess you're saying like that. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I'm trying to think of mapping an example of where we would do that. Nothing's coming to mind, but sure. Yeah. Or yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking of another, but yeah, also I mean, I think one thing is these are very hard constraints at this point, and we did do tests where we perturbed them, and how did things break down, and how much do you need to perturb to really break down the solution. But I think it's also interesting, what if we solve for these physical constraints too? So, but yeah, it is, I guess you could use one as almost a cross validation. Are you doing something reasonable? But we didn't do that in this case. Yeah.
Not really, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I want to talk a bit about what I hope will eventually be real data from a telescope that will be very large in nature. And this is sort of a description of a project and a cry for help at some level. This is the DSA 2000. It's an upcoming radio telescope that we're starting construction in about 18 months. It will consist of 2,005-meter antennas in a valley in Nevada called Spring Valley. It operates in a single frequency band, and it's basically a survey telescope. Spatial resolution is about 3.3 arc seconds, and we've been basically designing the telescope for about 4 years. We're in the final design phase, and like I said, construction starts in about 1.5 years. We got 5 years of surveys starting from 2028, and from the radio perspective, it really is transformational for radio astronomy. Every radio telescope ever built has detected about 10 million radio sources. We'll do that in the first 24 hours and increase the population 100-fold. And not just continuum radio sources, we'll increase the pulsar population 7-fold, 50,000 FRBs, billions of galaxies in H1. But there's a lot of data to get through to get to that science. In terms of where we lie, I think it's important to emphasize the decade of surveys, and this is one of, we hope, the keystone surveys for the decade. Of course, in the ground we've got Rubin in the optical, Monsi's pioneering cryoscope in the IR, near IR, and DS2000 radio. Of course, we've got a whole suite of experiments that have launched or are launching, spanning from Euclid, which launched, of course, last year, Spherex upcoming, and Roman and UVEX. So it really is the decade of surveys with large data. Many of these surveys are increasing the population, in a similar fashion, 100-fold compared to the existing population. So the DS2000 will be doing a number of surveys. It will do a cadenced all-sky survey to a depth of about 500 nanojanskis. That'll consist of a deep reference epoch and then a logarithmically spaced epochs for transient searching. We'll also do pulsar timing, but during that pulsar timing, we'll also do an intermediate depth survey. And finally, we'll be doing triggers for LIGO follow-up, as well as deep fields. Now, the big difference for our radio telescope compared to other interferometers is that we produce data products in real time, not visibilities, but actually images. Every single observation, which typically is about 10.2 minutes, 10.3 minutes, will produce 12,700 images. And that includes spectral line, polarimetric, and continuum. And commensally, we'll also do fast time domain searching, FRBs, and pulsars, where the output will be also produced in real time, i.e. dedispersed and folded profiles. How does it do that? Well, it has a new generation of digital backend, and this is really showing the input into this kind of huge digital backend. And I wanted to show this because for two reasons. The data rate's enormous, but there are multiple steps along here that are very amenable to the utilization of machine learning. And there are many steps that are not. The data throughput is enormous. It's about 200 terabits per second raw data to the system. And within that system, you've got some low-level processing that requires thousands of GPUs that's not very amenable to machine learning. And then you've got some steps that are. And what's nice is we've already got thousands of GPUs, which makes the application of machine learning a bit more fun to try. But within this system, you're really going from voltage data from the antenna, and you're going through the process of cross-correlating those data. And what we do that's kind of new for radio telescopes is that we actually kind of flag and calibrate and image those data in real time. And those image data products go to an archive. There are a number of broad areas within this signal chain and beyond that I think are very amenable to application of machine learning and AI. I'll talk to these very briefly. Our observation planner, I'll mention, is one. There are a couple of steps within this high throughput stream processing where machine learning definitely has potential application. In terms of the output image data, we're in a very unique regime. Interferometry presents an ill-posed inverse problem that usually requires the application of nonlinear deconvolution techniques to recover the true sky. Now, what's kind of special about our telescope is that we're actually almost approaching the linear deconvolution regime. And we have the most well understood PSF of any telescope ever built. And it's not measured. We understand it a priori. And that it really enters a whole new regime. And Katie and Liam Connor and Vikram Ravi and others have already demonstrated and developed a learning-based deconvolution tool called Polish that can be used for super resolution. So really applying modern computer vision techniques to the problems of super resolution and deconvolution. And Katie touched a bit on that a while back. And then I'll also mention that, and I'll touch on it again, that we want to produce a science platform where we have the infrastructure that's very amenable for tools and interfaces that can leverage ML and AI. I won't spend long on our scheduler. This is an example of all of our fields across the sky. You've got a standard survey, you've got pulsars, and you've got interrupts. Needs to be autonomous, dynamic, and reactive. In particular, we have to avoid interference from satellites and aircrafts, and we have to adapt in real time to the ionosphere conditions. And the OPL team that are working on this, the observation planning team, are already working on an AI-assisted automated scheduler. But I'm sure there are a lot more advanced techniques that can be leveraged from the CS community here towards this. Casey very precisely mentioned radio frequency interference. One of the steps in our stream processor that is amenable to the use of ML is inspecting for bad data. And that bad data is produced by interferers on the ground and in space. Here's an example of what we call a dynamic spectrum. The band we can observe in frequency and time, and you'll see there is structure in here. And that structure is caused, in this case, by terrestrial transmitters. And you have a process whereby you might want to detect that and separate that from the real signals that are actually also located. These are interference fringes. These are real. You've got to separate those two from each other, which you can do. But traditionally, that used to be done through human inspection. Each observation we have for one image reduces 33 trillion samples to inspect, so 3.6 terabits per second. And the quality of your ability to separate that artificial signal from that real signal, the astrophysical signal, will become increasingly important because we're fighting a losing battle with regards to spectrum usage. In particular, direct-to-cell communication is an upcoming threat we're very worried about, and the quality and fidelity of that flagging technique is very important. Now, there are already many different types of machine learning being applied to this problem, including deep convolutional neural networks. We already have an in-house automated flagger based on standard techniques like spectral kurtosis, but I think it's a great place to begin to work and apply machine learning-based techniques to try to improve relative to our more traditional approach. Next up is calibration. So that same 3.6 terabits per second of data, we have to use that to calibrate the instrument. What you have is the wavefront from the sky propagating through the atmosphere. In the same way, if you observe with an optical telescope, you get wavefront errors. The same happens here, typically because of the ionosphere as well as the varying temperature of the environment. And what we do in radio astronomy is a brute force approach. We take those order n squared measurements and we solve for the n parameters that characterize the calibration of the antenna. And that uses these pretty complex least squared optimization techniques. And it's extremely expensive. We actually have 32,000 CPU cores allocated to this problem in our current design. And I think it's really ripe for an ML-based approach. Because really what's causing the calibration variability are things like varying temperature, varying humidity, the variation of the ionosphere above the array. It should not require that order n squared approach and could be very amenable to a learning-based approach. And finally, I want to just mention what the final kind of main interface, I think, for potential application of ML and AI techniques, and that is the final data products and how we're going to host it. So our baseline right now is to host our archive with IPAC, and IPAC have a great suite of tools that they're going to make available, including Python notebook service, Jupyter Lab, for example. But we have been having discussions with our funders about migrating to a full science platform, ideally on the cloud. And actually, there's been a lot of discussion of trying to reach out to the broader community and try to co-locate on the cloud data from multiple surveys. In fact, all of the large surveys of this decade, really focusing on telescope modeling to really get to that telescope independent framework that allows the kind of tools and techniques that are being developed for the optical to be equally and easily applied to the radio. And that's not really, those steps are not necessarily ML based, but it will be a playground for ML and AI techniques to be applied to the data. One thing that's been discussed with our funders is actually having an LLM assisted user interface, and then actually for the public, a kind of natural language interface. Show me the largest galaxy, or in the radio, and so on. That's something we hope to begin to grow and develop in the next year. And I think a lot of the tools that we're hearing about more broadly, anomaly detection, classification, etc., should be generally applicable to this kind of science platform. Okay, I'll stop there. So
SETI problem, isn't it?
yeah, right. Well, I actually wanted to mention that actually similar tools can be applied to the FOB problem, but there are differences. One very common one is that the terrestrial interference is in the near field, it's out of focus, whereas the sky is in focus. So the wavefront from your interference will not have the same shape of the telescope as the flat wavefront that's coming from the astrophysical sky. That's one way you can distinguish. Now, you can distinguish RFI from FRBs. Now, the case that Matthew's mentioning here on the side, what about SETI? Well, SETI will have the property of looking like RFI in the spectral and time domain, but having wavefront properties consistent with the astrophysical sky. I think depending on the application, you've got to be very careful about your priors and how you prepare and search for those individual cases. FRBs versus RFI, I think, is more straightforward than SETI versus RFI. And yes, Liam is very involved in the project.
A question I have for you, your very high initial throughput data from, so high illumination LHC are investing significantly into, FPGA farms with autoencoderers to throw out 99.6% of their data, I think, to make it more manageable. And essentially that's doing a lot. They've hard-coded ML very much into there as a first order thing. I mean, could something similar be done with, or are there differences between that mean that you can't replace this sort of stuff with an ML solution?
Yeah, so I kind of only briefly touched on that. So the first, this actually does immediately go to the 2000 FPGAs. But unfortunately, we can't separate or destroy data at that point. All that data is necessary from as you propagate to the next step. It's only really at the end, when you're looking at the final data product, can you begin to strongly down select to reduce the data, because essentially all of the signals coming through here contain astrophysical information to construct the sky at this stage. One thing.
Do we want to, Katie, discuss or? Yeah, okay, so we have 15 minutes left for generic discussion. We thought we were running. Next step. I mean, one of the things is it feels a little bit like a very long information commercial where we think we're here to sales brochure, but there's a lot of stuff where there may be more in-depth presentation. The one thing we could do is say, okay, we'll take some of these talks and then ask the people if they can give a seminar or something. That's what we think that may have. Astronomer? Your CS question? Anyone question, please, right?
But I think with current method also, there are issues in terms of whether the libraries are open, whether you are well versed with how to use it with all the hyperparameters and so on. Also with the question. So that's one of the problems that I have been having with applying to our time series, the existing time series foundation model. It's not trivial with so many. Hoping that there may have been enough initial path to get there. But I think there are things we, you know, you can go to the answers now, as I said, you'll maybe send out further or something. But think about it and think about where you, if you're interested in this stuff, what would be the next step that you would like to see done? I mean, is it an informal discussion or something formal? Taking time for a lot of seminars going, you know, I run the NSFAI Institute, I'm involved in, I'm the education lead, and I do a monthly seminar. And we've had it day today, and someone talking about ACT stuff. Can be presented in a way that can be recorded in just in the I'm committed to a little bit of that. So there's the AI and how we can't have that methodically. Think about hijacking that somehow and making it fun so good in a way where so probably don't need all that background knowledge, but
try to make those connections. Yeah. I mean, one way around that is doing some sort of maybe a hackathon or maybe small point real problem about the first. Yeah. Talking about the boot camp was great because it was a combination between instructional and yeah. Yeah. And we run some schools along those lines.
Yeah, but this could be more detailed, perhaps.
Yes,
Thing that
yes,
we-
yeah, yeah. So in that sense, it would be interesting. here that we're not. Okay, I think we're at time. I'd like to thank Katie and Ashif for helping to organize this, and of course all our great speakers this afternoon. Hopefully the audience enjoyed it, and let's get the good discussion.
Do you want to try to catch Kitty before she goes? Oh, just,